February 26, 1991. The border region between Iraq and Kuwait. 0300 hours. The desert floor is shaking, but not from an earthquake. It is the idle rumble of a dug-in mechanized division. Inside the cramped metallic belly of a T-72 tank, an Iraqi commander strains his eyes against the periscope. Outside, the night is absolute. The smoke from burning oil wells to the south has blotted out the stars, turning the battlefield into an ink-black void. Visibility is effectively zero. This is the Republican Guard. They are not conscripts. They are the elite, hardened veterans of the 8-year war with Iran. They know tank warfare. They know that in this weather, and at this hour, the battlefield is static. To engage a target, you need to see it. To kill a target, you need to be within range. In the doctrine of armored warfare taught to them by Soviet advisors, the lethal envelope of a tank gun is rigid. 2,000 meters. Maybe 2,500 if the gunner is exceptional and the weather is clear. Beyond that, kinetic energy rounds lose their velocity, wind drift ruins accuracy, and the probability of a hit drops to near zero. The commander checks his position. They are part of a defensive screen, hull down behind a berm of sand. They are waiting for the coalition ground offensive to grind into their kill zones. They feel secure. The American and British forces are miles away, mere ghosts on a map. There is no engine noise on the wind, no thermal signatures on their primitive infrared sights, just the silence of the desert. Then, physics breaks. There is no muzzle flash in the distance. There is no warning. There is only a sudden, violent overpressure event. One moment, the T-72 tank to the commander's immediate right is sitting in silence. The next, it ceases to exist as a fighting vehicle. A hypervelocity penetrator, traveling faster than the speed of sound, slams into the turret ring. The kinetic energy transfer is so massive that the 40-ton vehicle shudders violently. The ammunition carousel at the base of the turret, the fatal flaw of Soviet auto-loader design, detonates instantly. The turret, weighing 12 tons, is ripped from the hull and tossed into the air like a tin lid. The shockwave hits the commander's tank a split second later. He screams into the radio, demanding a situation report. His crew is scrambling, panic rising in their voices. "Mine strike! They hit a mine!" the gunner yells. "Negative," the commander roars back. "No mines, we are in defensive positions, it was an airstrike." It has to be an airstrike, a laser-guided bomb from an invisible aircraft above the clouds. That is the only logical explanation. No tank on Earth can fire a shot that accurately, in pitch darkness, without revealing its position. But then, it happens again. 3,000 meters down the line, another fireball erupts. Then another. The cadence is slow, methodical, and terrifying. Crack, boom, crack, boom. The Iraqi radio network descends into chaos. Battalion commanders are screaming for coordinates, but there are no coordinates to give. They are sweeping the horizon with their optics, desperate for a muzzle flash, a tracer, anything to indicate where the fire is coming from. They see nothing, just the black wall of the desert night. The reports flooding in are impossible. Forward observers claim the impacts are coming from a vector nearly 5,000 meters away. 3 miles. The commander freezes. 3 miles? That is impossible. It is physically impossible for a kinetic tank round to travel 3 miles and hit a moving or dug-in target with lethal force. The dispersion would be massive. The optics required to see that far at night do not exist in their inventory. The Soviets assured them that the T-72 tank was the apex predator of the ground war. It had thick frontal armor, a powerful 125mm gun, and a low profile. It was designed to withstand the best NATO could throw at it. Yet, they are being dismantled, one, by a phantom. This is the terrifying reality of the Gulf War, a conflict that would brutally expose the technological gap between East and West. But before we reveal the machine responsible for this massacre, we need to understand the mystery of how one side could see in the dark, while the other was left to die in it. If you want to understand the hidden history of military technology and the cold, hard facts of warfare, make sure you are subscribed to Cold War Impact. We decode the machines that changed history. Back in the turret, the Iraqi commander makes a fatal calculation. He assumes that because he cannot see the enemy cannot see him. He orders his driver to reverse, to break the hull-down position and seek better cover. He engages his infrared searchlight, an active IR beam that helps his night vision equipment. To the naked eye, the beam is invisible. But out in the darkness, miles away, a sensor suite picks up that beam like a flare in a dark room. The Iraqi crews do not know it, but they are fighting a war against time travelers. They are using technology from the 1970s against a machine that has brought the digital age to the battlefield. The enemy isn't just shooting better. They are doing math that the Soviet designers never accounted for. The commander waits for the airstrike to end. He believes he is weathering a bombardment. He does not realize he is being stalked by a single ground vehicle. A predator that is sitting stationary, completely silent, watching his heat signature on a glowing green screen. The confusion among the Iraqi ranks is total. They are firing wild shots into the dark, hoping to suppress infantry or light vehicles. They are wasting ammunition on shadows. They believe they are fighting a conventional battle, where range is dictated by eyesight. They are wrong. The rules of engagement have changed. The distance between the combatants isn't just physical, it is a generational leap in lethality. And as the dawn threatens to break, the Lion of Babylon, the pride of the Iraqi Armored Corps, is about to realize that it is not the hunter, it is the prey. The panic on the front line transmits instantly to the Iraqi divisional headquarters, buried deep in a reinforced concrete bunker miles behind the berm. The air inside is thick with cigarette smoke and the static hum of Soviet-made R-123 radios. Senior officers hover over tactical maps, grease pencils in hand. They are trying to plot the enemy advance, but the data does not make sense. The reports coming from the forward armored brigades are hysterical, fragmented, and contradictory. Brigade 46 reports 20% losses, a communications officer shouts, pressing a headset to his ear. They claim they are under heavy artillery fire. Artillery does not hit moving targets with direct impacts, the general snaps back. Artillery creates craters. These reports say turret separations. They say clean penetrations. That is direct fire. The general stares at the map. He draws a line from the reported positions of his T-72 tanks to the known positions of the British 1st Armoured Division. He measures the distance with his thumb and forefinger. The gap is massive. 4,000 meters. Maybe 5,000. He throws the pencil down. Impossible. In the 1970s and 80s, the Soviet military academies taught a very specific version of physics. They taught that the maximum effective range of a tank battle was dictated by the curvature of the Earth, the limitations of optics, and the dispersion of the gun. According to every manual provided by Moscow, a tank engagement happened at 2,000 meters. Anything beyond that was luck. You fired high-explosive fragmentation rounds and hoped to strip away sensors. You did not fire armor-piercing sabots to kill. If the reports are true, the enemy is firing from distances where a T-72 tank appears smaller than a grain of rice in the gun sight. To hit a target that small, while moving, at night, requires a level of mathematical precision that shouldn't exist on a battlefield. The general turns to his technical advisors. Is it the Tau missiles? Are they using helicopters? Negative, sir. The weather is grounded. Too much smoke. No helicopters. Then it is the Americans, the M1A1S. It is a terrifying thought, but even the intelligence on the American Abrams tank suggests a kill range of 2,500 meters. What is happening out there in the dark is beyond the known capabilities of NATO armor. Back on the line, the psychological terror is breaking the Iraqi crews. Inside the remaining T-72 tanks, the gunners are blind. Their night vision relies on active infrared. This system uses a massive infrared searchlight mounted next to the gun. It projects a beam of infrared light, invisible to the naked eye, that illuminates the desert for their own sights. It is like using a flashlight in a dark forest. It works, but it has a fatal flaw. If the enemy has passive thermal sights, technology that sees heat instead of light turning on that infrared searchlight is suicide. It is the equivalent of lighting a flare and waving it over your head while screaming, "I am here." The Iraqi crews know this theory, but they have no choice. They cannot see. Desperation takes over. One by one, the T-72 tanks flicker on their searchlights, trying to find the predator that is eating them alive. 3 miles away, inside the British lines, this act seals their fate. The enemy gunners aren't just looking through glass optics, they are looking at digital screens. The thermal signatures of the Iraqi tanks are glowing white-hot against the cool desert background. When the Iraqis turn on their searchlights, they bloom on the British screens like supernovas. The massacre accelerates. The mystery deepens when a reconnaissance unit manages to inspect a destroyed hull during a brief lull in the fighting. The survivors, expect to find the scorch marks of a shaped charge, a missile, or a rocket that burns through armor. That would explain the range. Missiles can fly for miles. Instead, they find a small, clean hole, a kinetic entry wound. The metal around the impact point has behaved like a liquid, splashed outward by the sheer force of the impact. This was a solid metal dart, moving so fast that it turned the armor plate into molten slag upon contact. This discovery chills the blood of the investigators. Missiles fly 3 miles. Solid metal darts do not. Friction and air resistance slow them down. To punch through the frontal armor of a T-72 tank at 3 miles requires a muzzle velocity and a projectile design that defies Soviet understanding of ballistics. The Iraqi army is possessing the largest tank fleet in the region, built on the doctrine of mass and overwhelming force. But they are discovering that mass is irrelevant if you cannot get within fighting distance. They are like a boxer with a 3-foot reach fighting a sniper with a rifle. As the sun begins to bleed through the oil smoke, the scale of the destruction becomes visible. Burning hulks line the horizon. Turrets are planted in the sand like tombstones. And still, the enemy is nowhere to be seen. The survivors retreat, broadcasting a final, terrifying message to Baghdad. We are fighting ghosts. We are dying before we even see the flash. The question burns in the minds of the retreating commanders. What machine can calculate wind, temperature, humidity, and barrel wear to place a shot into a tank turret from a different zip code? And more importantly, why did the Soviet Union, the supposed superpower that armed them, fail to warn them about this? The answer lies in a piece of British engineering that was dismissed by critics, mocked for its complexity, and nearly cancelled before the war even began. As the sun burns off the morning haze, the battlefield reveals a new, twisted irony. The Iraqi commanders, now desperate, rely on the one advantage they believe they still possess: terrain. They pull their remaining armored divisions back, tucking them deep into urban environments and behind heavy concrete fortifications. If they cannot win a duel in the open desert, they will force the enemy to fight close. They know the American Abrams and the older British chieftains rely on kinetic energy penetrators, darts that rely on speed. Speed bleeds off over distance, and against concrete, darts can sometimes overpenetrate or shatter without causing the catastrophic spalling needed to kill a crew inside a bunker. The Iraqi strategy is sound, based on the physics of the smoothbore guns used by the Soviet Union and almost every other NATO nation. Smoothbore guns are like shotguns. They are designed for raw power and high velocity, perfect for shooting darts. But they lack the finesse for long-range demolition. Then, the twist arrives. An Iraqi spotter, hidden in a minaret miles away, watches through binoculars. He sees the silhouette of the enemy tanks cresting a ridge. They look different from the Abrams. They are boxier, heavier, their turrets draped in additional armor blocks that break up their outline. They move strangely, gliding over the rough dunes with a fluid, aquatic grace. Unlike the jarring, mechanical bounce of the T-72 tanks, the enemy tank halts. The turret rotates with eerie silence. It is aiming at a bunker complex, a reinforced concrete position that should be immune to standard tank fire at this range. The gun fires. But this projectile moves differently. It doesn't fly flat and fast like a dart. It arcs. It follows a high, calculated trajectory, lobbing through the air like an artillery shell. It impacts the concrete wall of the bunker. There is no piercing screech. Instead, there is a dull thud, followed by a delayed, devastating explosion. The concrete doesn't just crack, it atomizes. The shockwave transmits through the wall, blowing deadly scabs of concrete off the inside surface, shredding the men and equipment hiding within. The Iraqi spotter is stunned. This is not a tank gun. This is a sniper rifle crossed with a howitzer. The reports filter back to intelligence. The enemy is using a weapon system that defies the current NATO standard. While the Americans and Germans switched to smoothbore guns to maximize the speed of their darts, this mysterious British machine kept an obsolete technology, a rifled barrel. The grooves inside the barrel spin the projectile, giving it gyroscopic stability. It allows the tank to fire high-explosive squash-head Hesh rounds. These are not darts. They are plastic explosives that flatten against a target before detonating, creating a shockwave that ignores the thickness of the armor and destroys the target from the inside out. And then comes the impossible record. In the heat of the engagement, one specific British tank crew spots an Iraqi T-55 tank unit attempting to flank. The distance is ludicrous. The laser rangefinder flashes a warning. The target is over 4,700 meters away, nearly 3 miles. In a T-72 tank, the gunner would not even bother. The sight lacks the magnification, the computer lacks the ballistic data, and the gun lacks the accuracy. It would be a waste of a shell. But inside the British tank, the gunner is calm. He is not doing the math in his head. A computer from the 1980s, primitive by today's standards but revolutionary for its time, is calculating the rotation of the Earth, the crosswind, the temperature of the propellant, and the droop of the barrel. The commander gives the order. Fire! The round hangs in the air for what feels like an eternity. Seconds tick by. 1, 2, 3, 4. The Iraqi crew in the distance has no idea they are already dead. They are driving, breathing, thinking about their next meal. They do not hear the shot. The shell is traveling faster than the sound of its own launch. Impact. The T-55 tank disintegrates. It is the longest tank-on-tank kill in military history. A shot made from a distance roughly equal to 50 football fields laid end to end. The Iraqi morale collapses. They are fighting a machine that can switch from a hypervelocity sniper to a bunker-busting demo charge instantly. They are fighting a tank that doesn't miss. The Lion of Babylon has been unmasked as a paper tiger, not because the Iraqi soldiers lack courage, they fight fiercely, but because they have brought a knife to a nuclear gunfight. The Soviet technology they trusted, the autoloaders, the smoothbore guns, the infrared searchlights, have all become their coffins. But what exactly is this machine? What is the name of the beast that the British brought to the desert? And why was its success such a shock, not just to the Iraqis, but to the British government itself, who had almost scrapped the entire project just months before the war? The answer lies in a tank that was built around a single, stubborn philosophy: survival and precision at any cost. The mystery that terrified the Iraqi Republican Guard and baffled the Soviet observers had a name. It wasn't an American Abrams. It wasn't a secret prototype from the future. It was a machine that, just 4 years earlier, had been the laughingstock of NATO. It was the Challenger 1. To understand the magnitude of the shock felt on that desert battlefield, we have to rewind to 1987. In a high-profile NATO tank gunnery competition known as the Canadian Army Trophy, the British Challenger 1 team humiliated themselves. They were slow, they were inaccurate, their fire control systems were buggy and difficult to use. They placed last. The Americans with their M1S and the Germans with their Leopards looked at the British tank with pity. The British government was so embarrassed that they considered scrapping the entire Challenger fleet before it even saw combat. So, when the Gulf War began, the Iraqi intelligence, fed by Soviet reports, dismissed the British threat. They expected the Challengers to be slow, unreliable, and blind. They made a fatal error. They confused a peacetime competition with real war. In the sanitized environment of a shooting range, speed is everything. But in the chaotic, dirty, zero-visibility nightmare of the Iraqi desert, 2 things matter more than anything else: survival and optics. And in these 2 categories, the Challenger 1 was not a failure. It was a monster. The first part of the impossible equation was the armor. When the Iraqi T-70, 2 tanks did manage to land a hit, a rare occurrence they watched in horror as their shells simply shattered. The Challenger 1 was wrapped in Chobham armor, a highly classified composite material developed in immense secrecy in Surrey, England. Unlike the cast steel of the Soviet tanks, Chobham was a sandwich of ceramics, steel, and elastic layers. When a chemical energy round, like an RPG or heat shell, hit it, the ceramic tiles would shatter, disrupting the jet of molten metal. When a kinetic dart hit it, the varying densities of the layers would snap the rod in half. During the entire Gulf War, despite being in the thick of the heaviest fighting, not a single Challenger 1 was destroyed by enemy fire. The Iraqi tankers were firing at a ghost that was also invulnerable. It broke their will. They were fighting a tank that could shrug off their best shots like rain off a windshield. The second part of the equation, the reason the Iraqis were dying in the dark, was the TOGS, thermal observation and gunnery sight. While the Americans integrated their thermal sights directly into the gunner's primary optic, the British mounted the TOGS in a separate, armoured box on the side of the turret. Critics called it clunky, but in the desert, It was magic. It provided a crystal-clear, high-resolution picture of the thermal landscape. While the Iraqi commanders were squinting through dusty glass prisms, the British commanders were looking at a television screen. They could see the heat rising from a T-72's engine block from miles away. They could see the heads of the Iraqi crew sticking out of the hatches. They could see the difference between a truck and a tank by the heat signature of the wheels. The TOGs turned the night into day. It allowed the British to engage targets long before the Iraqis even knew a battle had started. The ghosts the Iraqis feared were simply men watching TV screens, calmly picking their targets. But the true shock, the moment that rewrote the history books, happened on February 26, 1991. A Challenger 1 from the Royal Scots Dragoon Guards was holding a position along the perimeter. The commander scanned the horizon using the TOGs. The landscape was a flat, shimmering haze of heat and dust. "Contact," the commander announced. "Tank." The gunner looked at his display. He saw a tiny, glowing dot on the horizon. It was an Iraqi tank, likely a T-55 or T-62, moving laterally. The laser rangefinder flashed. The distance was staggering. 4,700 meters. That is nearly 3 miles. 2.9 miles to be exact. In any other tank in the world, even the American M1A1, the commander would have said, out of range. The ballistic computers of the time simply weren't programmed to guarantee a hit at that distance. The margin for error was microscopic. A gust of wind, a fraction of a degree of barrel warp, or a slight miscalculation of the propellant temperature would send the shell missing by hundreds of feet. But the Challenger had the L11A5 rifled gun. Most modern tanks use smoothbore guns, smooth tubes like a musket to fire sabots at extreme speeds. They are fast, but at extreme ranges, they can lose stability. The British gun was rifled. It had spiral grooves cut into the barrel, spinning the projectile like a quarterback throws a football. This spin gave the round gyroscopic stability. It meant that even at 3 miles, the shell would stay true to its path. The crew decided to take the shot. It wasn't just a tactical decision, it was a challenge. Fin on. Action. The loader slammed a depleted uranium fin-stabilized sabot round into the breech. He followed it with a bag charge. The propellant wasn't in a brass casing, but in a silk bag, an old-school method that allowed for safe storage and massive power. Loaded. The gunner laid the crosshairs on the pixelated white dot. The computer calculated the lead. The turret hummed as it made micro-adjustments. Fire. The 120mm gun roared. The massive tank rocked back on its suspension. Because of the distance, the crew had time to wait. The projectile left the barrel at over 3,500 miles per hour, but even at that speed, it took over 5 seconds to cross the 3-mile gap. 1 Mississippi, 2 Mississippi, 3 Mississippi. For the Iraqi crew 3 miles away, there was no sound. The shell was traveling supersonic. It arrived before the boom of the gun. 5 Mississippi. On the TOG screen, the white dot flared brilliant white. The kinetic energy of the depleted uranium dart hitting the steel armor at that speed was cataclysmic. It didn't just penetrate. It liquefied the interior of the tank. The fuel ignited. The ammunition cooked off. The Iraqi tank ceased to exist. The British crew sat in silence for a moment, watching the burning wreck on the screen. They had just achieved the longest tank-on-tank kill in military history, a record that stands to this day. For the Soviet Union, observing from the sidelines, this was a catastrophe. Their entire military doctrine was built on the idea of closing the gap. They believed they could rush NATO forces, get inside the 2-kilometer range, and use their superior numbers to overwhelm the West. The Challenger 1 proved that they would never get close enough. The British had proven that with superior optics and rifled accuracy, they could destroy a Soviet tank division before the Soviets could even see them. The T-72, the pride of the export market, had been revealed as a death trap. The monkey model, excuse that the Iraqis had inferior versions, didn't matter. The physics were undeniable. The West could see in the dark. The West could kill from 3 miles away. The West was impenetrable. The shock wasn't that the Iraqis lost. The shock was that a tank the British nearly threw in the garbage had just dismantled the Soviet reputation for armoured supremacy. The Challenger 1 served its purpose. It was eventually replaced by the Challenger 2, an even more formidable beast that retained the rifled gun and the philosophy of protection first. But the ghost of that March 17th, 1982. The Polyarny Naval Intelligence Center, Murmansk Oblast. The air in Admiral Valentin Kozlov's office was thick with the scent of strong black tea and the faint, metallic hum of secure teleprinters. Outside, a relentless Arctic wind howled across the snow-covered Kola Peninsula, a sound Kozlov had associated with duty for 3 decades. His office was a sanctuary of polished mahogany and meticulously organized charts, a world of order built to counter the chaos of the unforgiving Barents Sea. On his desk, under the warm glow of a brass lamp, lay a file stamped Osobaya Papka special folder. It contained the overnight reconnaissance analysis from a recent NATO exercise in the Norwegian Sea, codenamed Alloy Express. Kozlov was a man of numbers, a naval officer who believed in the cold, hard mathematics of warfare. He knew the tonnage of every ship in the American Second Fleet, the range of their missiles, the sortie rates of their aircraft. His entire career was built on a foundation of predictable, quantifiable threats. But the data in this folder was different. It didn't feel like mathematics. It felt like a violation of logic. He stared at a series of satellite images and signal intelligence intercepts, his mind struggling to reconcile what the analysts were claiming with what he knew to be possible. The report detailed the actions of a single American carrier battle group centered on the USS Eisenhower. According to the data, this one group had, over a simulated 72-hour period, successfully defended against, tracked, and theoretically annihilated a combined force of over 200 Soviet aircraft and 30 submarines. It was a war game, yes, but the parameters were based on established Soviet doctrine, the massive multi-axis saturation attack designed to overwhelm any naval target. The numbers in the report claimed the attack hadn't just failed, it had been systematically dismantled before a single Soviet missile could have reached its primary target. Kozlov ran a hand over his tired face. It wasn't the defeat that baffled him. It was the efficiency of the annihilation. The report described a battle space hundreds of miles in diameter, controlled and sanitized by this single, floating fortress. It spoke of enemy aircraft being destroyed by missiles fired from ships over 100 miles away, of submarines being hunted and killed by aircraft they never knew were there. To Admiral Kozlov, a ship was a ship. You could sink it. But this report described something else entirely. It described a network, a single, integrated weapon that occupied an impossible volume of ocean space. He couldn't believe it. It felt like a deliberate piece of American disinformation designed to induce paranoia. Yet, the raw data from their own signals intelligence corroborated the claims. The sheer scale of coordinated firepower was a cognitive dissonance he couldn't resolve. It was a quiet moment of disbelief that would soon ripple through the entire Soviet Navy, and it's the kind of hidden history we explore every week here on Cold War Impact. If you enjoy uncovering these stories, consider subscribing. To understand the depth of Admiral Kozlov's shock, one must first understand the worldview of the Soviet Red Banner Northern Fleet. For decades, the Soviet Navy had been defined by a deep-seated inferiority complex. Born from the ashes of the Second World War, where its role was largely coastal and subordinate to the Red Army, the Navy looked across the globe at the uncontested might of the United States Navy with a mixture of envy and dread. American aircraft carriers, mountains of steel projecting power across every ocean, were the ultimate symbols of this dominance. They were floating slices of American territory, capable of launching strikes that could devastate entire nations. To the Kremlin, these carriers weren't just ships. They were strategic threats on par with nuclear missile silos. The man tasked with challenging this reality was Admiral of the Fleet Sergei Gorshkov, the charismatic and visionary builder of the modern Soviet Navy. Gorshkov knew he couldn't beat the Americans at their own game. Building massive carriers to match the American fleet would be ruinously expensive and technologically unfeasible for the Soviet industrial base. So, he devised a different strategy, a doctrine of asymmetric warfare built around a single brutal concept: the carrier kill. The entire structure of the Soviet Navy was reconfigured for this one purpose. Instead of building large, multi-purpose vessels, they created specialized hunter-killers. The pride of the fleet were the Tu-22M backfire bombers, supersonic aircraft designed to scream in at low altitude and launch massive, sea-skimming anti-ship missiles like the Kh-22, nicknamed the Carrier Killer. These missiles were enormous, the size of a small fighter jet, designed to fly at Mach 4 and deliver a 1-ton warhead or a nuclear payload into the heart of an American carrier. On the surface, They built ships like the Kirov-class battlecruisers, the largest surface combatants built since World War II, bristling with hundreds of missiles. Their primary armament, the P-700 Granite missile, could be launched in swarms, communicating with each other in flight to identify and overwhelm the most valuable target. Beneath the waves, a new generation of submarines, the Oscar class, were essentially underwater missile cruisers, each carrying 24 of these same Granite missiles. Soviet naval doctrine was a symphony of destruction, orchestrated to perfection. The plan was simple and terrifying. In the event of war, hundreds of missiles, launched simultaneously from submarines, surface ships and bombers, would converge on the American carrier from every point on the compass. They called it the saturation attack. Soviet analysts believed that no ship, no matter how well defended, could survive such a deluge of firepower. They had studied American defenses and concluded that while formidable, they had a breaking point. By launching more missiles than the carrier's defensive systems could possibly intercept, they would guarantee the kill. From their perspective in Murmansk and Moscow, it was a sound, logical plan. They saw the American carrier as the center of gravity, the queen on the chessboard. Remove it, and the entire board was theirs. Their intelligence focused on the carrier itself, its speed, its aircraft, its radar signature. The other ships in the group, the cruisers, destroyers, and frigates, were seen as supporting pieces, bodyguards that could be swatted aside or simply overwhelmed by the sheer number of incoming threats. They fundamentally misunderstood what they were looking at. They saw a group of ships. They failed to see the system. The American approach was born from a different philosophy, forged in the crucible of the Pacific War and refined in the paranoid cauldrons of the Cold War. The US Navy didn't think of the carrier as a single ship, but as the heart of a living organism, the Carrier Battle Group, or CVBG. This organism wasn't just a collection of vessels sailing in formation, it was a deeply integrated, multi-layered network of sensors and weapons, a mobile ecosystem of lethality. Its purpose was not merely to attack, but to establish absolute control over a massive area of air and sea. The genesis of its modern form came from a chilling realization in the 1960 seconds and 70 seconds. The Soviet saturation attack was, in theory, a viable threat. The American response was not to simply add more guns to their ships, but to completely redefine naval defense. They created a series of concentric defensive rings, each designed to thin the attacking Soviet herd. The outermost ring extended over 300 miles from the carrier. This was the domain of the F-14 Tomcat. More than just a fighter, the F-14 was a fleet defense interceptor, a flying missile battery. Its powerful AWG-9 radar could track 24 targets simultaneously, and its primary weapon, the AIM-54 Phoenix missile, was a revelation. A Phoenix missile could engage a Soviet bomber from 120 miles away, long before the bomber could get into range to launch its own anti-ship weapons. A squadron of Tomcats could create a defensive wall of radar and missiles, so vast that Soviet bomber formations would be decimated before their crews even knew the battle had begun. The next layer, roughly 100 miles out, was where the true revolution in naval warfare lay. This was the kingdom of the Aegis combat system, first deployed on the Ticonderoga-class cruisers. The Aegis system was the stuff of Soviet nightmares. Its heart was the Spy-1 radar, a phased array system that could detect, track, and direct weapons against more than 100 targets, sea-skimming missiles, high-diving bombers, even artillery shells simultaneously. A single Aegis cruiser provided more air defense capability than the entire naval task forces of World War II. It was the ultimate shotgun, protecting the fleet from any leakers that might slip past the F-14 seconds. An Aegis cruiser didn't just defend itself, it defended the entire group, linking its radar picture with every other ship to create a single, unified view of the battle space. Closer in were the destroyers and frigates, forming a ring of anti-submarine warfare, or ASW specialists. Using sophisticated towed array sonar and helicopters, equipped with dipping sonar and torpedoes, they sanitized the water for hundreds of square miles, hunting the Soviet submarines that sought to get close enough for a kill shot. And beneath the waves, leading the entire group, was a silent predator of their own. One or more Los Angeles-class hunter, killer submarines, whose job was to find and destroy Soviet missile submarines before they could ever fire a shot. Finally, at the very center, was the last line of defense, the Close-In Weapon System, or CIWS. Mounted on every major vessel, the Phalanx CIWS was a radar-guided Gatling gun that could spit out 4,520mm shells per minute, creating a literal wall of metal to shred any missile that made it through the other layers. This was the weapon that Admiral Kozlov was reading about. It wasn't a ship. It was a moving fortress of integrated denial, designed with one goal: to ensure that the Soviet saturation attack would break upon its shields like a wave against a cliff. The Americans had understood the Soviet doctrine perfectly and had engineered a systemic counter. They knew the Soviets were aiming 100 spears at their heart, so they had built 100 shields, each working in perfect harmony with the others. The destructive power wasn't just in the carrier's A-6 intruder attack jets. It was in the F-14's long-range interception, the Aegis cruiser's omniscient gaze, and the submarine's silent hunt. To the Soviets, who thought in terms of ship-on-ship combat and missile exchanges, the sheer comprehensive nature of this defensive ecosystem was a concept so alien it was almost unbelievable. The build-up to NATO's Alloy Express 82 exercise was, for the Soviet Northern Fleet's Intelligence Directorate, a prime opportunity. These large-scale war games were a treasure trove of data, a chance to peek behind the Iron Curtain of American operational security. Soviet electronic intelligence, ELINT, ships, disguised as fishing trawlers, loitered just outside international waters, their antennas straining to capture every radar emission and radio communication. Spy satellites were repositioned for optimal coverage. The expectation at Polyani was straightforward. They would observe the American carrier battle group, centered on the USS Eisenhower, perform according to known parameters. They anticipated seeing the F-14 seconds launch to intercept simulated bomber streams, the escort ships activate their fire control radars, and a flurry of communications as the group struggled to manage a multi-pronged threat. The Soviet analysts had a checklist. They expected to see the American systems strained. They wanted to measure the delay between target detection and engagement, to find the saturation point where the Aegis cruiser's computers would be overwhelmed, to identify gaps in the F-14's combat air patrol. They specifically believed that by simulating attacks from multiple vectors, 22 M backfires from the north, 16 Badgers from the east, and multiple submarine threats from below, they would force the Americans to reveal their defensive seams. Their entire doctrine was predicated on the idea that a sufficiently complex attack would induce chaos. They expected to hear frantic American radio traffic, see ships maneuvering in desperation, and witness the telltale signs of a system pushed to its breaking point. For them, it was a mathematical equation. They were adding variables of speed, altitude, and numbers, fully expecting the American solution to crumble under the pressure. The first reports that filtered back to Admiral Kozlov's desk were not shocking because of what they contained, but because of what they lacked. There was no chaos. There was no frantic radio chatter. There was an eerie, unnerving silence. The simulated attack began as planned. A wave of 42 22M backfire bombers was notionally launched from Soviet airbases, their flight paths programmed into the wargame. In the real world, these bombers would be screaming towards the carrier group at supersonic speeds. In the simulation, their electronic signatures and flight profiles were the enemy. From the Soviet listening posts, the first sign that something was wrong was the activation of the F-14 seconds AWG-9 radars. This was expected. What was not expected was the range. The American fighters saw the bomber stream from over 200 miles away. Then, long before the backfires could have reached their missile launch points, the intercepts began. The Soviet analysts listening in couldn't believe what their data was showing them. There was no frantic scramble. Instead, data links from an E-2 Hawkeye airborne early warning aircraft calmly assigned targets to specific fighters. One by one, Phoenix missiles were launched. On the Soviet intelligence plot, the icons representing their elite bomber crews began to blink out, one after another, at a range of over 100 miles from the carrier. They had been killed by an enemy they never could have seen. This was the first shock, the shock of lethality at an impossible distance. The backfires, the pride of Soviet naval aviation, had been rendered obsolete before they were even a threat. But the true horror was just beginning. As the surviving bombers from the first wave continued their inbound run, they entered the engagement envelope of the USS Ticonderoga, the first of the Aegis cruisers. The Soviet ELINT trawler, the Belomori, registered the activation of the Spy-1 radar. But it wasn't the frantic, sweeping search of a conventional radar. It was a constant, all-seeing stare. It locked onto dozens of simulated incoming anti-ship missiles simultaneously. Then the SM-2 missiles were fired. On the tactical plot, the remaining icons representing Soviet missiles and aircraft were wiped from the sky in a single, terrifyingly efficient volley. It wasn't a battle, it was an execution. A Soviet intelligence officer, watching the data stream in real time, was baffled. He later reported to his superiors that the American response was so fast, so automated, that it felt less like a naval engagement and more like a circuit board clearing a failed instruction. While the air battle was a massacre, the undersea fight was a ghost story. The Soviet plan called for Oscar-class and Victor-class submarines to penetrate the carrier group's ASW screen and simulate the launch of their Granite cruise missiles and torpedoes. They expected a tense cat-and-mouse game with American destroyers and helicopters. Instead, they were hunted by an enemy they were never aware of. The American Los Angeles-class submarine, the USS Baton Rouge, operating miles ahead of the carrier group, had already detected the Soviet submarines as they left their pens. It shadowed them, passing their location data to the carrier group. As the Soviet subs moved into position, they were systematically targeted by carrier-based S-3 Viking aircraft and SH-3 Sea King helicopters using a network of sonar buoys. On the Soviet side, there was only silence. A submarine would report its position and intention to attack, and then nothing. It would simply vanish from the exercise. The Soviet commanders couldn't understand. There were no reports of torpedo launches, no sonar contacts of American ships closing in. Their submarines were simply being erased from the board, picked off one by aircraft that appeared out of nowhere. This was the second, more profound shock, the shock of total battlespace awareness. The Americans weren't just defending themselves, they saw everything, everywhere, all at once. The carrier battle group wasn't a fortress with walls, it was a vast, invisible web. To touch any part of it was to alert the spider at its center. The immediate aftermath at the Northern Fleet headquarters was one of stunned professional disbelief. Admiral Kozlov and his team spent the next 48 hours in a state of controlled panic. Communications between Murmansk and Moscow crackled with urgent, coded requests for clarification. Analysts were ordered to re-verify every piece of intelligence. Could the Americans be faking their data? Was this an elaborate electronic warfare deception? But their own ships, their own satellites, told the same story. The raw data was undeniable. They had simulated an attack with over 200 aircraft and 30 submarines, the culmination of their entire naval doctrine, and the American response had been a calm, systematic, and almost insultingly easy slaughter. An emergency meeting was convened. Seasoned captains, men who had spent their lives training to fight the American Navy, stared at the battle plots with grim, ashen faces. They had always assumed there would be a fight, a bloody exchange, where their courage and numbers would eventually win the day. The data from Alloy Express suggested something far more terrifying. It suggested there would be no fight at all, just a swift, silent annihilation conducted at arm's length. The psychological impact was immediate. Their carrier-kill doctrine, the central pillar of their naval strategy for a generation, had been proven to be a fantasy. They had built 100 spears, only to discover their enemy was protected by a seamless, impenetrable force field. The Soviet admirals weren't just shocked, they were horrified. They had been preparing for the wrong war. The terrifying efficiency witnessed during Alloy Express 82 was not an accident of circumstance. It was the product of a deliberate and systematic integration of technology and doctrine that had been decades in the making. The American advantage wasn't just in having better ships or faster planes, it was in networking them together into a single cohesive killing machine. The true heart of the carrier battle group's dominance was an invisible architecture of data links known as the Naval Tactical Data System, NTDS, and its more advanced successors, Link 11 and Link 16. This was the digital nervous system that connected every component of the fleet into a shared consciousness. To the Soviets, who relied on voice commands and siloed information, this was a concept so advanced it bordered on science fiction. Through these data links, the E-2 Hawkeye, circling high above the fleet, could see a formation of incoming bombers, and without a single word being spoken over the radio, instantly transmit their location, speed, and heading onto the radar screens of the F-14 Tomcat interceptors and the Aegis cruiser below. The F-14 pilot didn't just see what his own radar saw, he saw what the Hawkeye saw. The Aegis commander didn't just see what his own powerful SPY-1 radar detected. He saw the entire battle space as a single, unified, tactical picture. This system transformed naval warfare from a series of individual duels into a coordinated, multi-domain slaughter. It allowed for a level of speed, precision, and collaboration that the Soviet command structure simply could not comprehend, let alone counter. This network was deployed across the entire US Navy, ensuring that every carrier battle group was not just a collection of ships, but a seamless, integrated weapon of continental scale. A stark example of this integrated lethality in action occurred in the tense skies over the Gulf of Sidra in August 1981. Libyan leader Muammar Gaddafi had declared the entire Gulf as Libyan territory, a claim the United States rejected. The USS Nimitz carrier battle group was sent to conduct freedom of navigation exercises, a direct challenge to Gaddafi's line of death. From the perspective of the two Libyan Su-22 fighter pilots scrambled to intercept the Americans, the situation must have seemed straightforward. They were experienced pilots in capable Soviet-built jets, flying to defend their nation's airspace. High above, however, an American E-2 Hawkeye was watching their every move from the moment their wheels left the runway. The Hawkeye's rotating radome, the tireless, all-seeing eye of the fleet, tracked the two Libyan jets, classifying them and feeding their data into the network. On board the Nimitz, two F-14 Tomcats from VF-41, the Black Aces, were diverted to intercept. The Libyan pilots likely never knew they were in danger. They saw the two F-14 seconds approaching head-on, a standard intercept. What they couldn't see was the stream of data flowing from the Hawkeye to the Tomcats, giving the American pilots a godlike awareness of the situation. They knew the Libyans' altitude, speed, and aspect angle before their own radars could even get a lock. As the distance closed, one of the Libyan pilots fired a heat-seeking missile. For the Americans, it was the final confirmation of hostile intent they needed. The response wasn't a panicked dogfight. It was a clinical, almost instantaneous execution. Both American pilots, having already achieved a missile lock, fired their AIM-9 Sidewinders. From the Libyan perspective, it must have been utterly baffling. One moment they were engaging an enemy, the next, both of their aircraft were disintegrating in balls of fire. The entire engagement, from missile launch to kill, lasted less than a minute. For the Libyans, it was a sudden, violent death. For the Americans, it was a textbook demonstration of the system at work. Detection by the Hawkeye, interception by the Tomcats, and a clean, efficient kill, all seamlessly coordinated through the network. The dominance extended to the silent, claustrophobic world of undersea warfare. Though here the shock was not of sudden violence, but of a slow, grinding, psychological dread. The GIUK gap, the stretch of ocean between Greenland, Iceland, and the United Kingdom, was the primary breakout route for the Soviet Northern Fleet submarines into the Atlantic. For a Soviet submarine captain, transiting this gap was the ultimate test of skill and nerve. Their mission was to slip through the Western naval blockade undetected and put themselves in a position to threaten American supply convoys or the carriers themselves. But waiting for them was a multi-layered net of American ASW assets. The Soviets knew about the surface ships and the patrol aircraft. What they couldn't truly appreciate was how these assets worked together. From the perspective of Captain Second-Rank Dmitry Volkov, commanding a new Victor III class nuclear attack submarine, the GIUK gap was a haunted house. For days, his sonar operators would hear nothing but the groans of the ocean. Then, a faint, almost imperceptible sound would appear on their screens, the distant thrum of a P-3 Orion patrol aircraft dropping a pattern of sonar buoys miles away. Volkov would order a course change, diving deep to try and slip beneath the thermal layers that could mask his acoustic signature. For a few hours there would be silence again. Then the sound would return, this time from a different direction. Another pattern of buoys. They were being herded. He couldn't see the enemy, but the all-seeing eye of the American network was clearly tracking him. The data from the sonar buoys was being relayed via satellite to ASW operational centers, which in turn were directing not just the P-3 seconds, but also American Los Angeles-class submarines lurking silently in the depths. Volkov and his crew were trapped in a state of constant paranoia. Every creak of the hull, every unexpected sonar return, was a potential sign of impending death. The Americans weren't just hunting them, they were toying with them, letting them know they were being watched. The horror for Soviet submariners was the dawning realization that there was no safe place, no shadow deep enough to hide from a system that could listen from the sky, the surface, and the depths all at once. Perhaps the most potent demonstration of this systemic dominance was not in a hot-fire engagement, but in a calculated act of strategic intimidation. In March 1986, the Aegis cruiser USS Yorktown and the destroyer USS Caron sailed directly into the Black Sea, deliberately crossing into waters claimed by the Soviet Union off the Crimean coast. This was a freedom of navigation operation designed to send a single, unambiguous message. From the Soviet perspective at the Sevastopol naval base, it was an act of breathtaking arrogance. The response was immediate and furious. MiG-23 fighters were scrambled. Su-15 interceptors were put on alert, and Soviet frigates were dispatched to shadow the American vessels. The Soviet commanders were itching for a fight, but they were helpless. As their fighters approached the American ships, their electronic warfare officers saw something that chilled them to the bone: the signature of the Yorktown's Spy 1 Aegis radar locking onto them. It wasn't just one lock. The system locked onto every single Soviet aircraft simultaneously, tracking them with unnerving precision. The Soviet pilots knew that if the Yorktown's captain gave the order, dozens of SM-2 missiles would erupt from the ship's vertical launch cells, and their entire air wing would be wiped from the sky in seconds. On the surface, the Soviet frigate Ladny pulled up alongside the Yorktown, making aggressive maneuvers and issuing warnings over the radio, which the Americans calmly ignored. The Soviet captain knew that his ship, with its conventional radars and fire control, was utterly outclassed. The Yorktown wasn't just a ship passing by, it was a node of the American global network, operating with impunity in their backyard. The all-seeing eye of the Hawkeye might not have been physically present, but its spirit was embodied in the Aegis system's omniscient gaze. The shock for the Soviets was one of pure impotence. They had all the hardware for a massive fight, but they couldn't use any of it. They were completely and totally checkmated, forced to watch as the Americans sailed calmly through their claimed waters, demonstrating to the world that the Soviet Union's maritime borders were an imaginary line the US Navy could erase at will. The slow dawning horror that began in the intelligence rooms at Polyarny eventually reached the highest echelons of the Soviet state. The realization that their entire naval doctrine was a house of cards was not a single dramatic event, but a creeping, corrosive truth that worked its way through the military establishment. This admission was never public, of course. Outwardly, the rhetoric of Soviet naval might continued unabated. But internally, the evidence was undeniable. Secret memos circulated within the main naval staff and the Ministry of Defense, their pages filled with grim analyses of NATO exercises and the chilling capabilities of the Aegis system. Admiral Gorshkov himself, the architect of the saturation attack doctrine, was forced to confront the reality that the technological pendulum had swung decisively in America's favor. In a classified 1984 review of fleet readiness, a document never intended to see the light of day, the conclusion was stark. The combat survivability of Red Banner Northern Fleet aviation and submarine assets in a full-scale engagement with a modern US carrier battle group is assessed as unacceptably low. The enemy's integrated data link and automated air defense capabilities represent a qualitative superiority that cannot be overcome by quantitative means at this time. This was a stunning admission. The entire Soviet military philosophy was built on quantitative means: massed tanks, massed infantry, massed missiles. To admit that numbers were no longer enough was to admit that their core strategic assumption was dead. The Soviet leadership was truly baffled. They had spent trillions of rubles building the perfect counter to the American carrier, only to find the Americans had changed the rules of the game entirely. The Soviet response was a mixture of desperation and imitation. Having realized their saturation attack doctrine was obsolete, they embarked on a frantic and ruinously expensive effort to build a counter. This led to two major initiatives. The first was the creation of their own aircraft carriers, the Kuznetsov class. These were not direct copies of American supercarriers. The Soviet industrial base simply couldn't produce such complex vessels. Instead, they were heavy aircraft carrying cruisers, a hybrid design that reflected their deep-seated missile-centric philosophy. Unlike American carriers, which were pure floating air bases, the Kuznetsov was heavily armed with its own massive P-700 Granite anti-ship missiles. It was a carrier that didn't fully trust its own aircraft. The planes themselves, the Su-33 and Mi-G-29 Kelvins, were formidable fighters. But the carrier's ski-jump launch system, a concession to their inability to develop reliable steam catapults, meant the aircraft couldn't launch with a full payload of fuel and weapons. This severely limited their range and combat effectiveness. The Soviet carrier was an answer to a question the Americans had stopped asking 20 years earlier. It was designed to fight a ship-on-ship battle, while the US Navy was already mastering a networked over-the-horizon war. The second initiative was an attempt to create a Soviet version of the Aegis system. This was Project Fort, which resulted in the 300 farads RIF naval air defense system, known to NATO as the SAN-6 Grumble. Deployed on their Kirov-class battlecruisers, the 300 farads was a powerful system capable of engaging multiple targets with its vertically launched missiles. On paper, it looked like a worthy competitor. But it was a technological echo, not a true equivalent. Its phased array radar was less powerful and had a slower scan rate than the American spy one. More importantly, it lacked the true networking capability of the American system. An Aegis cruiser shared its consciousness with the entire fleet. A Kirov-class battlecruiser fought largely on its own. It was a powerful fortress, but it was an isolated one. Espionage also went into overdrive. The KGB's Directorate T, responsible for scientific and technical intelligence, launched numerous operations to steal data on the Aegis system, phased array radar technology, and the computer processors that made it all work. While some operations were successful, stealing blueprints is not the same as stealing the industrial and technological base required to build them. The Soviets could acquire the schematics, but they couldn't replicate the decades of American investment in microelectronics, software engineering, and systems integration. Their attempts to counter the carrier battle group failed because they were trying to solve a systemic problem with individual pieces of hardware. They were building better spears, while the Americans had perfected the force field. The psychological impact on the Soviet Naval Command was profound. The initial shock and disbelief gave way to a quiet, grudging respect, which eventually soured into a deep-seated institutional resignation. For Soviet naval aviators and submarine captains, the American carrier group became a bogeyman, an almost mythical entity. They trained endlessly, pushed their machines to the limit, and maintained a facade of confidence. But the underlying knowledge of their enemy's superiority was corrosive. They knew that in a real war, their missions would be suicidal. This created a strange duality. In public, they were the proud heirs of the Red Navy. In the privacy of their ready rooms and wardrooms, a cynical gallows humor took hold. The joke among backfire pilots was that the American F-14 was the world's most effective crew separator. It separated the crew from the aircraft with a Phoenix missile from 100 miles away. This wasn't fear in the sense of cowardice. It was the rational, professional understanding that they were on the wrong side of an insurmountable technological gap. The American carrier battle group had achieved a level of dominance that transcended the physical battlefield. It had lodged itself in the minds of its adversaries, creating a psychological checkmate. The Soviets realized they could not win a conventional naval conflict against the United States. The destructive power of a single US carrier battle group had forced the second most powerful navy in the world to tacitly admit defeat without a single shot being fired. The Cold War, in its essence, was a battle of competing philosophies, and nowhere was this more evident than on the high seas. The story of the Soviet Navy's shock at the American carrier battle group is not simply a tale of technology, but of two fundamentally different approaches to the concept of power. The Soviet philosophy was one of the decisive blow, the silver bullet. It was a mindset born from their land, war heritage, the massed artillery barrage, the deep armored thrust. They applied this thinking to the sea, investing their genius and treasure into creating the ultimate hero weapons, the Mark IV Kh-22 missile, the city-sized Kirov-class battlecruiser, the Oscar-class submarine bristling with 24 unstoppable Granite missiles. Each was designed to be a champion, a single piece capable of slaying the American Queen and checkmating the game. They sought to build the perfect spear. The American philosophy, however, had evolved beyond the individual weapon. It was a philosophy of systems, of networks, of an integrated whole that was infinitely more powerful than the sum of its parts. They understood that in the complexity of modern warfare, the winner would not be the one with the sharpest spear, but the one who controlled the entire environment in which the spear was thrown. The weapon was not the F-14 fighter, nor the Aegis cruiser, nor even the carrier itself. The weapon was the battle group, a single, distributed, thinking organism of steel and silicon. This was the ultimate expression of American dominance. Not just the ability to build a superior machine, but the ability to build a superior system. They didn't just build a better shield, they built a sentient fortress that could see and kill in every direction at once. The ultimate bloody demonstration of this systemic superiority would not come against its intended adversary. The Soviet Union, groaning under the weight of its own internal contradictions and the crippling expense of the arms race, would collapse before a final naval showdown could occur. But the weapon forged to fight it was about to be unveiled to the world. In August 1990, Saddam Hussein's Iraq invaded Kuwait, and the world watched to see how America would respond. The answer came in the form of Operation Desert Shield, and later, Desert Storm. 6 U.S. carrier battle groups, including the USS Ranger, Midway, and Theodore Roosevelt, converged on the region, forming an iron ring in the Red Sea and the Persian Gulf. This was the system, perfected in the tense cat-and-mouse games of the Cold War, finally unleashed in a full-scale conflict. For the world, watching the war unfold live on television, it was a stunning, almost terrifying spectacle. The level of coordination was something no one had ever seen. The E-2 Hawkeyes flew continuous orbits, their radars painting a complete picture of the airspace over Iraq and Kuwait, vectoring fighters to their targets with digital precision. The Ticonderoga-class cruisers, the descendants of the ship that had so shocked the Soviets, formed an impenetrable air defense shield, their Aegis systems standing guard against any potential Iraqi Scud missile attacks. From the decks of the carriers, a relentless wave of air power was launched. A-6 Intruders and F divided by A, 18 Hornets flew thousands of sorties, striking targets with a level of accuracy that seemed impossible. They weren't just dropping bombs. They were using laser-guided munitions to put weapons through the air vents of specific buildings. This was the culmination of the network. A satellite would identify a target, an AWACS or Hawkeye would manage the airspace, a tanker would refuel the strike package, and the fighters would deliver the payload, all working in a seamless, real-time symphony of destruction. The Iraqi military, a large and battle-hardened force, was systematically dismantled. Their command and control evaporated, their air force was swept from the sky, and their ground forces were left blind and helpless. The carrier battle groups provided the overwhelming bulk of the coalition's air power in the opening weeks of the war, proving that they were not just defensive fortresses, but the sharp end of America's global power projection. The Soviets watched in horrified silence. Everything their intelligence had warned them about in the 1,980 seconds was now being proven in combat. The speed, the efficiency, the total battle space awareness, it was all real. They had built a navy to sink a carrier. The Americans had built a system that could dismantle a country. In the end, the great Soviet Navy died not with a bang, but a whimper. As the USSR dissolved, its mighty fleet was left to rust. The half-finished aircraft carriers were sold for scrap. The Kirov-class battlecruisers, those behemoths bristling with missiles, were tethered to piers in Murmansk, their nuclear reactors cold, their hulls streaked with decay monuments to a failed doctrine. They were powerful weapons in search of a system that never truly existed. The American carriers, by contrast, sailed on. They remain to this day the centerpieces of American power, constantly evolving, integrating new aircraft, new data links, and new capabilities. The legacy of the Cold War carrier battle group is the very foundation of modern warfare. The concept of network-centric operations, of integrated, multi-domain battle, is the direct descendant of the philosophy that so baffled the Soviet admirals. The final poignant irony is that the Soviets always saw the carrier as the target. They never truly understood that the carrier was just the heart. The real power was in the invisible web of data that surrounded it, a web they could never see, but one that ultimately ensnared and crushed their grandest ambitions. They spent a generation learning how to kill a ship, while America had quietly perfected a new way to win a war.